This is going to be very helpful, I promise you. Let's start by talking about the problem. Beautiful writing, poor sales. So, as you know, we at Bardsy interact with thousands of writers, and about 10 to 15% of them just cannot write well enough to make it in the business. And you can refer to Stephen King's book on writing, and he basically makes the same argument. You need a certain level of fluency before you can expect to become a successful author. So 10 to 15%, past that, that means 85 to 90% are just fine. Yet, even though they can write well enough to pass this threshold, they aren't finding agents, or the books they self-publish aren't selling well. There's a simple solution to this, which I say over and over again, which motivates this particular talk, which is that you have to invest time in your story. So let me talk about that. I want today to draw a clear distinction between story on the one hand and writing on the other. And the argument is that you can work on story separately from your writing, and at the same time, you can work on writing separately from your story. And what this is going to allow you to do, it's going to allow you to rebalance the time you spend toward producing a novel. The number one problem that these people have, and which I believe is what's causing their poor sales or lack of success in querying agents, is that they spend all their time focusing on producing beautiful sentence after beautiful sentence. And then they spend their time revising to make the sentences more beautiful. And when they try to produce a draft or a novel based on those beautiful sentences, it just doesn't do its job, right? Remember, you have one job as an author, and that's to satisfy your readers. Agents, if you will, are only looking for novels that they believe will satisfy readers and therefore sell. So when you focus on your writing, you're missing out on the big picture, what readers really want. So there's a background question. Are story and writing separable? And the answer is yes. And I want to point to a very particular phenomenon to show some proof of that, and that is adaptation. So let's consider our favorite stories, Cinderella, Romeo and Juliet, or we could consider something more modern and yet still contemporary adaptations, Wuthering Heights and Frankenstein, or something even more recent, Project Hail Mary or Last of Us. In each of these cases, you see the same story presented in multiple formats. So, Cinderella. The story has appeared in books, television programs, I'm not sure about movies, definitely stage plays, a wide variety of formats. Same thing with Romeo and Juliet. We had a play, 1600s. We had a movie in the 1970s, which left a lasting impression on me. I don't know if you've ever seen that movie, Justin, but some people in the audience will know the scene to which I refer. And then we've had, more modern treatments, either with revised characters, gender reversals, etc. Wuthering Heights and Frankenstein, both classic novels produced in the 19th century and yet receiving updated movies coming out in the not too distant future. And then finally, a more recent works, right? A novel, Project Hail Mary, which has turned into a movie, a video game, Last of Us, which has turned into a television show. What this tells us is that there is some story underlying any given, we'll call it literary or artistic work. Now, diving a little bit more deeper, here's a standard example we use, which is the minimal complete story for Romeo and Juliet. You guys can pause and read this at your leisure. The idea is that this is the story, right? No matter how it's told, movie, play, video game, graphic novel, it's the same exact story. I'm not going to say it's a blueprint or a template or an underlying story structure. No, that's too distancing, right? This here is the story. Nothing more and nothing less. Now, what I'm not saying is that there aren't things that make a novel unique, right? But a novel is a format that a story is presented in or is transmitted through, right? A novel, in a sense, is a story in 100,000 words, as opposed to a film, which is a story in pictures and sound and anywhere between 90 minutes and 4 hours, depending on how self-indulgent the producer director is. Novels are unique, right? I'll just name a few things to buttress my belief in this. First of all, much more so than any other media, they depend on imagination. Movies, television especially, are inherently spectative, right? You watch them, as opposed to novels where you recreate them in your imagination. A very important point, which we're not going to dive into today any more deeply than that. Secondly, novels are about sustained investment and reward. This is a point that's worth paying attention to, right? Why is a novel 100,000 or so words long? Because that's how much you need for the reader to invest, for them to build the world, the characters, etc., and then to have that payoff at the end. Movies aren't like that, right? Graphic novels aren't like that. Novels are. Readers expect and want to make that investment, and at the same time, they expect and want that kind of reward at the very end. And then finally, the most unique thing about novels is it gives you a kind of telepathic access to the character's thoughts. So we talk about internality, we talk a lot about empathy, we talk a lot about vicarious experience. All of that turns on the reader's ability to access the character's thoughts. And if you watch carefully, movies and television especially, other media can't offer that, right? Again, they're spectative, right? You watch movies, whereas you imagine and experience novels. And anytime a movie or TV show attempts to give you access to a character's thoughts, it usually doesn't work or ends up being heavy-handed, right? Some common techniques are voiceovers or narrative or something like that, and it's just not the same thing. So you can observe this for yourself, right? Watch a movie and see if you can figure out what a character is thinking in a given moment. So novels are unique, right? A unique format. But we can still separate story from words. So why should we bother separating story from words? The primary reason, and I'm going to say this so you can put it into practice as opposed to just acknowledging it, is in terms of energy allocation, right? A novel, good, bad, or sort of indifferent, is going to take about at least 6 months, probably 8 months to a year to write, even if you're a very experienced writer. A first novel will often take 2 years. During that time, you have to think about where you're going to put your energy, right? Arguably, there's 3 places to put it. The point of this talk is we want you to put it on story, at least put much more energy into story than most people commonly put. And then secondly, we have our tools. Most of Bardsy's tools focus on either the story itself or the relationship between the story and writing, right? Story is so important that there are tools that we've developed to specifically address working on your story, developing it. For example, the minimum complete story. We just saw one for Romeo and Juliet. We have the value triangle, which is a way of understanding how your story is supposed to satisfy your audience. We have the continuity and value delivery spreadsheet, which is a way of translating your story to each chapter so you can write it successfully. And then we have the character equation, which is a way of more fully developing that particular story element. And then finally, third, this I think will be the most shocking, is that when you separate story from word, that has profound implications for how you get feedback, how you give feedback, and then how you revise your work. And I'll conclude with that thought in the last slide. So let's talk about energy allocation. To be a successful author, you really have to fulfill 3 jobs. First, you have to be a storyteller, and second, you have to be a writer, and third, you have to be some kind of promoter. Nearly everybody focuses way too much time on the writing aspect. We're not going to talk about the promoting aspect today. Equally important, but something that's beyond the scope of this approach. What we do want to focus on is storytelling. And the problem, again, restated, is that when you focus on beautiful writing, you're not going to find an agent and your book isn't going to sell. Because, by and large, there's a caveat, that's not what readers are interested in. Readers are interested in a good story. Proof, examples, well, if you look at any group of writers, the comment I see over and over again is, the writing was crap, right? So take any famous bestseller. I'm thinking, and I don't diss them, Colleen Hoover. I forget the guy who's the mystery writer. I think it's Cleve Cussler. No, he was the adventure writer. The mystery writer who just wrote a novel with Reese Witherspoon, his name escapes me. Right, the writing is roundly criticized. And guess what? Doesn't matter, right? There's an audience for their work because the writing is good enough to transmit the story. So arguably, the main reason for focusing on this separation is that you're going to reallocate your investment away from writing, right? Less focus on low-level things to story, more focus on high-level things. In other words, we want to separate development, story development, from transmission, from putting your story into words. Therefore, as an author, you have 2 tasks. And you have to make sure you have time for both. So think about it this way. Your novel is a story in words. Therefore, you need story, and then you need to put it into words. I hate to say it, but it's that simple. So then we can talk about tools. But the most important immediate implication of this idea is what it means for feedback. When you give feedback, when you get feedback, there's really only 2 things you can say. You can either say, the story needs work. In other words, certain elements are underdeveloped or the elements don't fit together properly, right? You might say this character lacks motivation. I didn't understand their arc, how they changed from the beginning to the end of the novel. You might say the world doesn't match the plot. Those things are all about story development. And then the second thing you might say is that the transmission is ineffective, right? So something is wrong with the way your chapters are being presented. You should go with what's in chapter 7 before you talked about what you currently have in chapter 3. That's a matter of sequencing. You can talk about emphasis, right? I thought chapter 9 had a great point, right? The hero discovered something about themselves, but it was buried, right? There wasn't enough emphasis on that, so the reader didn't see it. And then finally, you have the broader problem that we always deal with, which is cutting a story up into a novel's chapters, right? Remember, each chapter has to be satisfying and yet leave the reader wanting more. So let me entertain thoughts. Either of you have any? And if not, that's perfectly fine. All right, so on to our discussion for today. We will be talking about one tool for Justin and another tool for Ariel.
Bardsy delivers the tools, guidance, and support you need to produce compelling novels. Our well-researched and thoroughly tested approach includes our minimum complete story, a 90-second exercise that keeps your writing on track while fueling creativity. Bardsy Publishability Index, a 23-dimension checklist that offers attainable goals and provides actionable feedback. And our brand new comprehensive character developer that helps you construct unforgettable characters. Come see for yourself at Bardsy.com today. Try our workshop or enter our first chapter contest. Then, when you're ready, Elite Membership delivers writing groups, personal coaching, and a curated community. With Bardsy, your work will captivate everyone, from agents to publishers, and, most importantly, your readers.